I came home early with takeout for our anniversary and found the dining room decorated for someone else's proposal. I left work 2 hours early that Friday specifically to surprise my wife Melissa with her favorite Thai food and a bottle of the wine we'd had on our actual wedding day 6 years earlier. The kind of small, thoughtful gesture I'd been planning for weeks as a way of marking our anniversary without the pressure of a big, expensive outing neither of us particularly wanted this year, given how busy things had been with her new job and my own long hours at the firm. Melissa and I had met in our late 20s, both of us a little cautious after previous relationships that hadn't worked out, and had built what I genuinely believed was a solid, steady marriage over the 6 years since our wedding. We weren't the kind of couple who did grand romantic gestures often, more the type who showed love through consistency, through remembering small details, through the accumulated weight of showing up for each other reliably over years rather than through dramatic declarations. Tracking down that specific bottle of wine from our wedding had taken me nearly 3 weeks of calling around to different specialty shops, a small, quiet effort I'd kept entirely to myself, wanting the surprise to land exactly right on the actual evening. I remember feeling genuinely excited walking up to our front door, takeout bags in hand, rehearsing in my head how I'd present the wine, imagining her face when she saw I'd remembered the specific bottle, a detail I was fairly confident she wouldn't expect me to have tracked down given how busy the past few months had been for both of us. I texted her earlier that day, a vague message about working late to cover the surprise, feeling almost giddy about how well the whole plan seemed to be coming together as I drove home earlier than she'd expect. What I found instead, letting myself in through our own front door, stopped me completely in the entryway, keys still in my hand, takeout bags slowly slipping from my fingers as I took in a scene that made absolutely no sense against anything I understood about my own marriage. Our dining room, the one Melissa and I ate dinner in most nights, had been transformed into something I didn't recognize. String lights, the warm, twinkling kind, had been hung carefully along the ceiling molding. Candles, dozens of them, sat arranged across every flat surface, unlit but clearly staged, waiting for evening. A trail of rose petals led from the doorway to the table, which had been set, not for 2 people the way it usually was for our dinners, but with an elaborate centerpiece and what looked distinctly like preparation for a specific, singular moment rather than an ordinary meal. And on the table itself, propped against a vase of flowers I didn't recognize from any florist we regularly used, sat a small black ring box. I stood there for what felt like a genuinely long time, though it was probably only seconds, my brain working through possibilities that felt increasingly absurd the longer I stood in that doorway. Had Melissa somehow arranged this for me, some elaborate reversal of a traditional proposal, planning to ask me something significant on our anniversary in a way I hadn't anticipated? That explanation felt implausible almost immediately, both because it didn't match anything about how Melissa approached romantic gestures in our relationship, and because, walking closer, I noticed something that made my stomach drop entirely. I set the takeout bags down slowly on the entryway table, some instinct telling me I needed my hands free, needed to move carefully through whatever was actually unfolding in my own house. I noticed, walking closer, a small handwritten card propped near the flowers, unsigned but clearly written in handwriting I didn't recognize, something about the next chapter of our story, language that felt jarringly, painfully specific in a way that made it impossible to construct any innocent explanation for what I was looking at. I stood there rereading that single line several times, some part of my brain still trying, almost comically, to find an interpretation that didn't point toward the obvious, devastating conclusion already forming underneath my rational thinking. The ring box, when I opened it with hands that were shaking more than I wanted to admit, contained a ring that wasn't mine to give, an engagement ring I had never seen before, in a style that looked nothing like anything Melissa and I had ever discussed or browsed together during the actual planning of our own wedding 6 years earlier. I heard footsteps on the stairs behind me before I could process much further, and turned to find Melissa standing there, her expression shifting through several rapid stages. Surprise, then something that looked disturbingly close to panic, before settling into a kind of frozen, guilty stillness that told me, more clearly than any words could have, that whatever was happening in that dining room was not something I was supposed to have discovered yet. "Home early," she said, her voice strange and too high, the words coming out clipped and automatic rather than natural. Her eyes darted just briefly toward the dining room behind me, then back to my face, a flicker of calculation I could see her trying to suppress even as it happened. "I wanted to surprise you," I said, gesturing vaguely at the takeout bags now sitting abandoned near the front door. "For our anniversary, I got your favorite Thai place and I found that wine from our wedding." I gestured toward the dining room behind me. Apparently I wasn't the only one planning a surprise tonight. Melissa's face went through another rapid series of expressions before she seemed to settle on something resembling composure, though her hands, I noticed, were trembling slightly at her sides. "It's not what it looks like," she said, which is, I would learn over the following excruciating hour, almost never actually true when someone says it. What it actually was unfolding in fragments over a conversation that felt like it lasted both several minutes and several hours simultaneously, was this. Melissa had been planning to end our marriage for reasons she struggled, even in that moment, to fully articulate beyond vague references to growing apart and wanting different things, and had, in the months leading up to that Friday, begun a relationship with a man named Colin, someone she'd met through her new job, a relationship that had apparently progressed quickly enough that he had, that very evening, been planning to propose to her in our dining room in our house. On the exact date of my own anniversary with her, a scheduling collision that felt too surreal to be anything other than some kind of cosmic cruelty. He was supposed to be here at 7, she said, her composure fully cracking now, tears streaming down her face in a way that in that specific moment generated no sympathy in me whatsoever, only a kind of disbelieving fury I hadn't known I was capable of feeling. I told him you'd be working late. I didn't think, she stopped herself, seeming to realize mid-sentence how damning the rest of that thought would sound spoken aloud. You didn't think I'd come home early on our anniversary, I said, finishing the sentence for her, to surprise you, with takeout and wine from our actual wedding. The details continued unraveling over that conversation, each one worse than the last. Melissa and Colin had been seeing each other for approximately 4 months, based on what she eventually admitted, a timeline that meant this relationship had begun and progressed to the point of an imminent proposal, entirely within a period where I had believed, with total confidence, that our own marriage, while perhaps not perfect, was fundamentally stable and headed toward the kind of ordinary, comfortable future most 6-year marriages settle into. She'd apparently confided in Colin that she planned to leave me soon, a timeline that had, based on her own account, kept shifting further into the future each time he asked about it directly, until he'd apparently decided independently that a proposal might accelerate her timeline, unaware that the entire premise he was operating under, that Melissa's marriage was already effectively over in every way that mattered, was something she'd never actually gotten around to acting on with me. I asked her, at one point during that unraveling conversation, how she'd managed the practical logistics of an entire second relationship, without me noticing anything substantial, genuinely curious despite the devastation. Because in my mind, our life together had felt full enough that I couldn't imagine where an entire parallel relationship had fit. She explained, haltingly, that most of it had happened during what I'd understood to be legitimate work commitments, an increasingly demanding new job that had genuinely required some additional hours she'd apparently stretched and supplemented with time spent with Colin, using the real, ordinary busyness of a new position as cover for something else entirely. It was a strange, specific kind of violation, realizing that the very details I'd extended trust and understanding toward, her demanding new job, the reason I'd planned such a low-key anniversary in the first place, had actually been, at least in part, the exact mechanism enabling the thing that was now ending our marriage. I found myself, in the middle of processing my own devastation, experiencing a strange, secondary wave of something almost like pity for Colin, a man I'd never met, who was, at that very moment, likely getting ready somewhere, probably rehearsing what he planned to say, with absolutely no idea that the woman he intended to propose to was still, legally and in every practical sense, married to someone else. Someone who was currently standing in his own dining room holding the ring box meant for that exact proposal. I imagined him picking out a tie, checking his reflection, running through the words in his head, entirely unaware of the two-front deception he'd unknowingly become a participant in, and something about that image, absurd as the whole situation already was, made the entire evening feel even more surreal than it already did. Does he know you're still married? I asked, genuinely uncertain what the answer would be, though some part of me already suspected what it was going to reveal about the full shape of what I'd stumbled into. Melissa's silence answered the question before she managed to speak. I told him we were separated, she finally said, that the divorce was basically already in motion. I know that wasn't true. I know I should have actually told you first, should have actually started that process before letting things with Colin go this far. But every time I tried to bring it up with you, you seemed so happy, so unaware anything was wrong, and it just felt easier to keep managing both things separately instead of blowing everything up at once. I want to be honest that in that moment, standing in a dining room decorated for a proposal I was never meant to witness, holding a ring box meant for another man to present to my own wife, I felt something in me go entirely, coldly quiet, the emotional equivalent of a system shutting down every non-essential process to conserve whatever energy remained for simply getting through the next several minutes without completely falling apart. You need to call him, I said, right now. Before he shows up here expecting a proposal to go exactly as planned, and finds both of us standing here instead. Melissa made that call with me standing several feet away, listening to her half of a conversation that grew increasingly strained as Colin, on the other end, apparently began asking questions she clearly hadn't prepared adequate answers for. I didn't hear his side of it, but based on Melissa's responses, growing shorter and more clipped as the call continued, it became clear that this was the moment Colin was also learning, in real time, exactly how thoroughly he'd been misled about the actual status of the relationship he believed he was about to formalize. He didn't come to the house that evening, which I suppose was the only small mercy available in an otherwise catastrophic night. Melissa hung up eventually, sat down heavily in one of our dining room chairs, surrounded by candles and rose petals meant for an entirely different ending to the evening than the one now actually unfolding, and put her head in her hands. I didn't stay to comfort her. I want to be clear about that, because I think there's a version of this story where the instinct might have been to somehow manage her emotional state in that moment, to soften a devastating discovery for the sake of keeping the immediate situation calm. I didn't have that instinct available to me anymore. I picked up the takeout bags I'd dropped by the front door, most of the food probably cold by then, and left, driving to my brother's apartment across town, where I spent the next several hours explaining, in a version of the story that felt too absurd to be real even as I was the one living through it, exactly what I'd walked into that evening. My brother Tom listened to the entire account without interrupting, refilling my glass more than once as I worked through the details, and when I finally finished, simply said, "I don't think I've ever heard anything like that happen to someone I actually know." It wasn't much as far as comfort goes, but there was something steadying about having another person confirm, out loud, that what had just happened to me was as genuinely surreal as it felt, rather than some overreaction on my part to an ordinary, survivable marital problem. I stayed on his couch that night, unable to face the idea of going back to a house still decorated for another man's proposal, and started, somewhere around 3 a.m, quietly making a mental list of everything I'd need to figure out in the coming days. The weeks that followed moved with a strange, brutal efficiency once the initial shock wore off. I filed for divorce within the month, unwilling to spend any additional time inside a marriage that had apparently already been quietly, secretly over for Melissa long before that Friday evening revealed it to me. She didn't contest much of the process, seeming to understand, finally, that whatever chance existed for some kind of honest conversation about the state of our marriage had been forfeited the moment she chose managing 2 separate relationships simultaneously, over having a difficult but necessary conversation with me directly. I never met Colin, and I never particularly wanted to, though I did learn, through a mutual acquaintance months later, that his relationship with Melissa hadn't survived the fallout from that evening either, the entire foundation of trust between them apparently too damaged by the revelation of exactly how much he hadn't actually known about her real marital status to recover from. I found myself thinking about him occasionally in the months that followed, a stranger I'd never spoken to, bound to me forever by one absurd, overlapping evening, both of us unknowing casualties of the same set of choices Melissa had made independently of either of us. I moved out of the house we'd shared, into an apartment of my own, and spent a good deal of the following year working through the specific, disorienting kind of grief that comes not just from a marriage ending, but from realizing the ending had already been quietly, deliberately in motion for months before I had any indication anything was wrong. I went to therapy, more consistently than I'd ever managed before in my life, working through not just the immediate betrayal, but the harder, more unsettling question of how thoroughly I'd misread the state of my own marriage, how confidently I'd walked through that front door with takeout and wine, certain I understood exactly where things stood between us. My therapist, over the course of that year, helped me untangle something I hadn't expected to have to reckon with, a tendency, apparently long-standing in me, to interpret the absence of visible conflict as evidence of genuine stability, rather than checking in more actively to confirm that assumption was actually still true. It wasn't a comfortable realization, understanding that some of my own habits, my preference for steady routine over difficult, probing conversations, had likely made it easier for Melissa's second relationship to develop undetected for as long as it did. I don't say that to excuse what she did, but I've come to believe that healthy relationships require more active maintenance than I'd been providing, more direct, uncomfortable check-ins, rather than simply trusting that a lack of arguments meant everything underneath was fine. What I know for certain now is that I stopped assuming stability in a relationship is something you can simply trust without ever actively checking in on it. Melissa and I had drifted, over the final year of our marriage, into a kind of comfortable autopilot, each of us assuming the other understood how things stood, neither of us actually saying much out loud about how we each genuinely felt. I don't think that drift excuses what she did. Nothing excuses planning an entire second relationship, allowing another person to move toward proposing marriage while still legally married to someone else. But I've come to understand it as a warning, one I carry with me now into anything serious I build going forward, that silence in a relationship isn't neutral. It's not simply the absence of conflict. Sometimes it's the exact condition something devastating grows quietly inside of, waiting for an anniversary, an early homecoming, a bag of takeout, to finally bring it into the light.